"We're not running a daycare here, ma'am. This is the advanced marksmanship qualifier. Maybe the admin pool has an open desk for you." The crowd of younger, cockier soldiers, all taught muscle and fresh-faced arrogance, let out a collective, cruel snicker. The man who spoke, Captain Jake Thorne, held his clipboard like a verdict, his crisp, new uniform a stark contrast to the woman he addressed. She stood alone, a figure of profound stillness amidst the nervous energy of the high desert firing range. Her uniform was faded by 1,000 suns, the fabric softened to the color of dust, yet it was immaculate, every crease earned, every thread in its place. She said nothing. Her gaze, calm and distant, wasn't even on the captain. It was on the wind, reading its invisible currents as they whipped across the canyon. But when the visiting general, watching from the distant control tower, zoomed in on his binoculars and saw the precise, economical way her hands moved over the components of an old, heavily modified M21 rifle, he felt a flicker of something ancient and familiar, a ghost of a memory he couldn't quite place. He saw the quiet, absolute confidence that needed no announcement. If you believe true strength doesn't need to raise its voice, type competence below. The captain, however, saw only what his prejudice allowed. He saw a woman who looked to be in her late 30s, older than the fresh-out-of-training operators surrounding her. He saw a quietness he mistook for timidity, a deliberate pace he mistook for hesitation. He saw a rifle that belonged more in a museum than on a Tier 1 qualifying range. "Seriously, Sergeant," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension as he gestured toward her weapon with a dismissive flick of his pen. "Is that a family heirloom? We're running 7.62 NATO rounds through state-of-the-art, semi-auto platforms here. That bolt-action antique is going to slow down the whole line." He was performing for the gallery of young soldiers, establishing his authority, making an example of a nail that didn't stick up but simply looked different. The laughter grew a little bolder. The woman, Sergeant Eva Rostova, continued her work, her silence a shield he could not penetrate. She seeded the action into the worn, dark walnut stock, the metal clicking into place with a sound as soft and final as a closing door. Her hands, which he hadn't bothered to truly look at, moved with a fluid grace, a practiced economy that spoke of tens of thousands of hours of repetition. There were no wasted movements, no fumble parts. It was a ballet of mechanical precision. She attached the scope, its oversized objective lens looking strangely modern on the vintage frame, and began to adjust the turrets with audible, satisfying clicks that echoed faintly in the sudden lull. Her focus was so absolute, so complete, that Captain Thorne and his audience of jesters seemed to cease to exist. They were merely part of the landscape, no more significant than the scrub brush or the distant mesas. This infuriated him more than any retort could have. He was a man accustomed to being the center of any room he entered, his rank and his sharp academy record a passport to deference. Her utter indifference was an insult far greater than the one he had just leveled at her. He was about to speak again, to order her off his range, when the tower's loudspeaker crackled to life. "All shooters, prepare for course of fire. Range is hot." Eva slid a single hand-loaded cartridge, its brass polished to a soft gleam, into the chamber and closed the bolt. The sound was smooth, solid, a whisper of oiled steel. She settled behind the rifle, her body becoming an extension of the earth, a stable, unmoving platform of bone and will. Her calm was unsettling. It was the calm of the deep ocean, a profound stillness that hinted at immense, unseen power dwelling far below the surface. The humiliation was a palpable thing, a heavy blanket of scorn laid upon her shoulders by the captain and his acolytes. The younger soldiers, emboldened by their officers' open disdain, began to shuffle their feet, their smirks widening as they whispered to one another. They created a small, invisible circle of exclusion around her, a quarantine zone separating the perceived professional from the perceived amateur. They checked their own rifles, all gleaming black polymers and Picatinny rails, slapping magazines into place with theatrical force, the clatter of their ambition echoing across the firing line. They looked at her old wooden rifle and saw weakness. They looked at her silence and heard incompetence. They were wrong on both counts. Eva Rostova did not flinch. She did not speak. She did not acknowledge the world of assumptions being built around her. Her universe had contracted to the circular view through her scope, the gentle rise and fall of her own chest, and the fickle, treacherous wind. As she settled her cheek against the worn stock of the M21, a piece of wood smoothed by her own hand over countless hours in lonely, patient vigils, the sleeve of her uniform rode up just an inch. For a fleeting moment, a network of fine, silvery scars was visible on the skin of her forearm, intricate and complex, like a map of a place no one would ever want to visit. It was a detail no one on the line noticed. They were too busy admiring their own reflections in their high-tech optics. Her rifle, the one Captain Thorne had derided as a museum piece, was anything but. It was a legacy. The action was from an original M21, prized for its reliability, but the barrel was a custom-made, cryogenically treated masterpiece of modern metallurgy. The trigger group was tuned to a crisp 2.5-pound break with zero creep. The stock was weighted and bedded with a loving precision that made it a seamless extension of her own body. It was a hybrid weapon, a perfect fusion of old-world soul and new-world science, built not for looks or for impressing junior officers, but for a single, sacred purpose, to place one round, exactly where it was needed, under any conditions, without fail. It was a professional's tool, and its quiet, unassuming appearance was its greatest camouflage. The captain paced behind the line, his boots crunching on the gravel, a predator circling his chosen prey. "All right, let's see what you've got," he muttered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, positioning himself directly behind Eva, a silent, looming judgment. He expected a complete and utter failure, a public vindication of his initial assessment. The injustice of the moment hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But for Eva, there was no injustice. There was only the problem. The problem was the distance. The problem was the wind. The problem was the shot. And for a woman like her, problems were not obstacles to be lamented. They were simply puzzles to be solved. Her breathing slowed, each inhale and exhale a measured, rhythmic tide. The world outside her scope faded to a muted, irrelevant blur. The captain, the laughing soldiers, the weight of their judgment, it all dissolved into the wind she was now a part of. The course of fire was designed by sadists to separate the merely excellent from the truly elite. It was a symphony of failure waiting for a conductor. The first set of targets appeared at 600 meters, then 800, then a brutal transition to 1,000 meters, with targets exposed for mere seconds before disappearing. The wind, a living entity in this canyon, was a nightmare. It gusted and swirled, changing direction and velocity without warning, pushing rounds wide and low. The air was filled with the sharp crack of high-velocity rifles, followed almost immediately by the frustrated curses of the shooters. Pings of successful hits were sporadic, interspersed with the dull thud of misses against the dirt berms. The young operators, for all their swagger and cutting-edge equipment, were struggling. Their advanced ballistic computers gave them data, but the data was a snapshot of a moment that had already passed. They lacked the intuitive feel, the instinct that only thousands of hours of experience could burn into a shooter's soul. Captain Thorne watched, a smug satisfaction growing on his face. This was as it should be. The course was hard. It was meant to be hard. His boys were finding their limits, and the woman with the antique would surely be hopelessly lost. He glanced at Eva. She had not fired yet. She remained perfectly still, her eye glued to her scope, her finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. She was watching, learning, feeling the rhythm of the canyon. She tracked the dance of heat mirage rising from the desert floor. She watched a piece of tumbleweed skitter across the downrange area. She felt the subtle pressure change on her cheek. She was building a mental model of the chaos, finding the pattern within the noise. Then, the final challenge was announced from the tower, the voice tinged with a cruel sort of glee. Final target engaged. 1 round. 1 minute. Distance, 1,242 meters. Good luck, shooters. A small, 10-inch circular steel plate, painted a mocking shade of bright orange, was illuminated by a spotlight far downrange, almost a mile away. It was partially obscured by a simulated piece of cover, leaving only a sliver visible. It was the impossible shot, the one designed to humble everyone. A collective groan went up from the line. Rifles were fired in desperate haste. Rounds were sent downrange more in hope than in expectation. Through the powerful spotting scopes, the observers could see puffs of dust erupting all around the target. Left, right, high, and low. No one was even close. The wind was simply too unpredictable, the distance too extreme. Captain Thorne folded his arms, a self-satisfied smirk firmly in place. This would be the final, embarrassing nail in the coffin of the silent sergeant's ambitions. He waited for her to either give up or send a wild, futile shot into the hillside. Eva's movements were so subtle they were almost imperceptible. She made a final, minute adjustment to her scope's elevation turret. Click, 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 not based on a digital readout, but on a deep, instinctual knowledge etched into her mind. She shifted her rifle's bipod a fraction of an inch to the left, settling it into the gravel. She took a slow, deep breath, held it, and then let half of it out, finding that perfect, still moment of respiratory pause. In the world of her scope, the distant orange target shimmered and danced in the heat mirage. The wind, which had been defeating the other shooters, was now her ally. She had waited for it, studied it, and now understood its momentary pattern. She wasn't fighting it. She was using it. She calculated the holdover in her mind, not just for drop, but for windage, for spin drift, for the Coriolis effect. It was a complex differential equation solved in a heartbeat, a feat of mental ballistics that would have fried the circuits of a lesser mind. Her finger moved from the guard to the trigger. The captain watched, his smirk unwavering, ready for the anticlimax. The entire line had gone silent, their own failed attempts leaving a bitter taste in their mouths. They were all spectators now, waiting for the final act of this small drama. Eva squeezed the trigger. There was no jerk, no flinch. The rifle pushed back against her shoulder with a firm, familiar recoil, the sound a deep, resonant boom that was somehow different for the sharper cracks of the other rifles, more authoritative, more final. The single brass casing ejected in a graceful arc, catching the harsh desert sun for a brief, brilliant moment before landing softly in the dust beside her. And then there was silence, a profound, deafening silence that stretched for an impossibly long time. It was the silence of anticipation, the silence of a held collective breath. 1 second, 2, 3. The bullet was on its journey, an invisible messenger crossing the vast expanse of the canyon. For seconds, 5. The soldiers looked at each other, then back at the unmoving form of Sergeant Rostova. The captain's smirk began to falter, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. And then it came. From over a kilometer away, a sound traveled back against the wind. It was not a loud sound. It was small, crisp, and utterly unambiguous. Ping. It was the sound of a 175-grain Sierra Match King bullet striking hardened AR-500 steel at over 1,000 feet per second. It was the sound of impossibility being rendered possible. It was the sound of every arrogant assumption on the range being shattered into a million pieces. In the control tower, the spotter's voice came over the radio, choked with disbelief. Hit. I repeat. Center mass hit. Target down. The brilliant orange circle had vanished. Complete, stunned silence descended upon the firing line. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. The young soldiers stared, their mouths agape, their high-tech rifles suddenly feeling like clumsy toys in their hands. Captain Thorne stood frozen, his face a mask of utter shock. The smirk had evaporated, replaced by a slack-jawed vacancy. He blinked, as if trying to wake from a dream. No, he whispered, the word barely audible. No way. That's not possible. A fluke. It has to be a fluke, but he knew, and everyone on that line knew, that a shot like that, in these conditions, was no fluke. It was mastery, It was perfection. It was a statement made not with words, but with a single, perfectly placed piece of lead. From the control tower, a figure descended the metal steps with a deliberate, unhurried gait. The sun caught the 3 silver stars on his collar, and a wave of recognition and tension rippled through the assembled soldiers. It was General Marcus Thorne, a living legend within the special operations community, a man whose combat record was the stuff of hushed, reverent whispers in barracks and briefing rooms across the globe. He was on the base for a high-level inspection, and his unexpected presence on the range turned the atmosphere electric. As he walked across the gravel, the crunch of his boots was the only sound. All motion ceased. Soldiers who had been slumping in defeat snapped to rigid attention. The general's eyes, sharp and discerning, swept over the line of stunned young operators, but they did not linger. They were fixed on one person. He walked directly towards Sergeant Eva Rostova, his path unwavering, ignoring his own nephew who stood nearby, pale and speechless. The general stopped a few feet from her. Eva had remained in her firing position, her eyes still looking downrange, as if confirming her work. She calmly worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, and only then did she begin to rise, her movements fluid and economical even in the presence of overwhelming authority. As she stood and faced him, bringing her hand up in a crisp salute, the general's gaze dropped from her face. It went first to the M21 rifle she held, his eyes narrowing in recognition, a flicker of memory crossing his features. He saw the specific where patterns on the stock, the unique configuration of the scope mounts. Then, his eyes fell upon her forearms. The desert sun illuminated the network of silvery scars, no longer hidden by her sleeve. They were fine, intricate lines, almost like surgical incisions, covering the skin from her wrist to her elbow. The general froze. His breath hitched audibly. The look on his face shifted from professional curiosity to profound, earth-shattering shock. His eyes widened, and he took a half-step back as if struck by a physical force. The pieces clicked into place in his mind, the old rifle, the impossible shot, the impossible calm, and now the scars. The legend he had only heard about in classified after-action reports and closed-door debriefs was standing right in front of him. "Wait," he gasped, his voice a choked whisper that still carried across the silent range. He pointed a trembling finger not at her, but at her arm. "Those scars. You're that soldier." The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken history. It was a question that contained within it stories of desperate battles in faraway lands, of missions that had gone horribly wrong and had been saved by a single, unseen hand. It was a question that acknowledged a myth made flesh. The younger soldiers looked on, utterly bewildered, their respect for the general warring with their confusion. Captain Thorne's face, already pale, turned ashen. He had a sickening feeling that the hole he had dug for himself was about to become a chasm. General Thorne's voice, no longer a whisper, boomed across the range with the force of a controlled detonation. He turned his gaze upon his nephew, and the look in his eyes was one of glacial fury mixed with profound disappointment. "Captain," he said, his voice dangerously low, "do you have any idea who this is? Do you have any concept of the catastrophic failure of judgment you have just displayed in front of your men?" Captain Thorne could only stammer, "Sir, I don't understand." "She's Sergeant Rostova." The general cut him off with a sharp, brutal gesture. "You understand nothing. You see nothing. You assume everything. Give me your file." Now, a terrified aide, who had followed the general from the tower, fumbled with a ruggedized tablet and quickly brought up the requested personnel record. He handed it to the general, his hand shaking slightly. General Thorne didn't look at it himself. He held it out for his nephew to see, his arm rigid with anger. "Read it," he commanded. "Read it aloud. I want you and every soldier on this line who laughed to hear it." Captain Thorne took the tablet, his eyes scanning the screen. His face went through a rapid series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally, abject humiliation. He swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he began to read. "Name, Rostova Eva. Sergeant First Class." He paused, his voice faltering. Unit, classified. Project, Chimera. A wave of murmurs went through the soldiers. Project Chimera was a ghost, a myth. A Tier 1 special mission unit, so secret its existence, was officially denied. It was the unit they sent when Delta Force was considered too high profile. Primary military occupational specialty, 18Z, Special Forces Senior Sergeant. The captain read, his voice barely a whisper now. Secondary specialties, Master Sniper Instructor, Joint Special Operations Command. Covert Action Specialist. Advanced Infiltration. His voice trailed off as he scrolled down the list of awards. Distinguished Service Cross. Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters. Bronze Star with V-Device. Purple Heart with 4 oak leaf clusters. The list went on. A litany of heroism at the highest echelons of the United States military. Combat hours logged behind a scope. 4,312. Confirmed engagements at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. Classified. Mission history. Redacted. 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 The word redacted appeared over and over, a testament to a career spent entirely in the shadows, on missions the public would never know about. Note from previous commanding officer, JSOC, the captain read the final entry, his voice breaking. SFC Rostova is not a sniper. She is a surgical instrument of national policy. The single most precise and reliable long-range marksman this command has ever produced. Her call sign, Ghost, is not an affectation. It is a statement of fact. A heavy, profound silence fell once more. The general took the tablet back. Then he did something that sent a shockwave through every person present. General Marcus Thorne, a 3-star general and a giant of the special warfare community, turned to face Sergeant First Class Eva Rostova. He straightened his back, brought his heels together, and executed a slow, perfect, deliberate salute. It was not the casual salute an officer gives a subordinate. It was a gesture of profound, bottomless respect. Sergeant Rostova, he said, his voice now filled with reverence. Your file does not do you justice. It is an honor to finally meet you, ma'am. For a moment, the world was frozen. Then, as one, every soldier on that firing line, from the youngest private to the most seasoned NCO, followed their general's lead. The sound of 24 hands slapping crisply against brows echoed in the canyon. A thunderous, unified chorus of respect, apology, and awe. Captain Jake Thorne stood alone, his hands empty at his sides, his face a portrait of a man who had just realized he had tried to teach the master how to paint. The story of what happened on Range 7 did not just spread, it detonated. It moved like wildfire through the barracks, whispered in hushed tones in the mess hall, and became the top story on the base's unofficial forums and message boards. The details were embellished, as they always are, growing with each telling until the event took on the quality of myth. The impossible shot became a shot made blindfolded in a hurricane at a moving target the size of a quarter. But the core of the story, the truth of it, remained intact. A quiet, unassuming sergeant had, with a single bullet, silenced the loudest voice of arrogance and reminded an entire generation of young warriors what true professionalism looked like. The woman they had dismissed was now known by a single, reverent name, the Ghost of the Range. The young soldiers who had snickered and mocked her were the most profoundly affected. Their cocksure swagger evaporated, replaced by a quiet, watchful humility. They no longer saw a faded uniform. They saw experience. They no longer heard silence. They heard discipline. They began to study her from a distance, observing the methodical way she maintained her gear, the unnerving calm she projected under pressure, the absolute focus she brought to the most mundane tasks. They started asking questions, not of her directly, they were too intimidated for that, but of their NCOs. They wanted to know about Project Chimera, about the old M21 platform, about what it takes to become a legend. The culture of the marksmanship program began to shift, slowly but surely. The emphasis moved from having the newest, most expensive gear to mastering the fundamentals. The loud bravado was replaced by a quiet intensity, a shared understanding that competence was the only currency that truly mattered. Captain Jake Thorne was summoned to his uncle's temporary office. The door remained closed for over an hour. No one heard what was said, no voices were raised. But when Captain Thorne emerged, he was a changed man. The arrogant, polished veneer had been stripped away, leaving behind someone humbled and deeply contemplative. He looked 10 years older. Later that week, he found Sergeant Rostova in the armory, meticulously cleaning her rifle. He approached her not as a superior officer, but as a penitent. He stood before her, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but stooped with the weight of his mistake. Sergeant Rostova, he began, his voice quiet and strained. There are no words to adequately express how unprofessional my conduct was. My assumptions were inexcusable. I was wrong. I am deeply sorry. He stood there, bracing for a reprimand, a lecture, or worse, a dismissive silence that would confirm his irrelevance. Eva Rostova finished wiping down the bolt of her rifle with an oil-soaked cloth, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She looked up at the captain, her expression unreadable. There was no anger in her eyes, no triumph, no "I told you," so there was only a calm, steady assessment. After a moment that stretched into an eternity for the shamed officer, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood, sir," she said. Her voice was quiet, neutral, devoid of any emotional charge. And then she returned to her work, her focus absolute. The two words were a masterclass in professional grace. They were an acceptance of his apology, an acknowledgement of his contrition, and a quiet closing of the chapter. She offered no absolution because it wasn't hers to give. He had to earn that from himself. But she also offered no condemnation, demonstrating a profound understanding that dwelling on the mistake was less important than learning from it. Her response was not a slight. It was a lesson. It taught him that for a true professional, drama and ego are distractions from the mission. The past was the past. The only thing that mattered was the standard and the work required to maintain it. The lesson was not lost on him. In the weeks that followed, a remarkable transformation occurred. Captain Thorne began to observe more and speak less. He started asking his senior NCOs for their opinions. He spent less time with his clipboard and more time on the line with his soldiers, learning their strengths and weaknesses not from a file, but from personal interaction. He had been humbled, but in that humiliation, he found the seeds of true leadership. Meanwhile, Eva Rostova, the ghost of the range, deflected the myth-making with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything else. When younger soldiers approached her with awestruck questions, she would gently steer the conversation back to the fundamentals: wind reading, trigger control, breathing. She never once mentioned the incident with Captain Thorne or the impossible shot. She was seen one afternoon quietly mentoring one of the very soldiers who had laughed the loudest, patiently showing him a subtle flaw in his stance, her hands guiding his position with the gentle confidence of a master craftsman. Her competence was not a weapon to be wielded against others. It was a tool to be shared. A few days later, a small ceremony was held in the ready room of Range 7. The spent 762mm casing from her legendary shot, recovered from the dust, had been polished and mounted on a simple, dark wooden plaque. Below it, a small, engraved brass plate was affixed. It didn't mention her name or rank at her specific request. The inscription was simple, yet it captured the entire ethos of the event, a new commandment for all who would train there. It read, "Competence is silent." The plaque was hung on the wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. It became a quiet, powerful symbol of the day that assumptions died and respect was reborn. Months bled into a year. The seasons changed over the high desert, but the change that had taken root on Range 7 was permanent. The Rostova standard, as it came to be known, was now the foundation of the entire marksmanship program. The culture had fundamentally shifted. The focus was no longer on flash, but on substance. The ready room was quieter, the firing line more focused. The soldiers who trained there now carried themselves with a different kind of confidence. Not the brittle shell of arrogance, but the solid, quiet assurance that comes from disciplined practice and a deep respect for the craft. Captain Jake Thorne was almost unrecognizable from the man he had once been. He had become one of the most respected company commanders on the base. He led from the front, but with a newfound humility that earned him the fierce loyalty of his soldiers. He made it a personal ritual to brief every new group of trainees in the Range 7 ready room, standing directly beneath the plaque with a single brass casing. He would tell them the story of that day, but he told it from a unique perspective. He told it as a story of his own failure. "Look at this," he would say, his voice steady and calm, gesturing to the plaque. "This casing represents the most important lesson I ever learned in my career. I stood on this very spot, and I judged a soldier based on my own ignorant assumptions. I saw a woman, I saw an old rifle, and I saw silence, and I filled in the blanks with my own prejudice. I was a captain, and I was a fool." He would let that sink in, his vulnerability a powerful teaching tool. That soldier, he'd continue, didn't need to say a word. Her competence spoke for her. It spoke louder than my rank, louder than my insults, louder than the laughter of everyone who followed my lead. Let this be your lesson. Assumptions are a liability this profession cannot afford. Judge a person on one thing and one thing only, their demonstrated ability. Respect is not given by rank. It is earned through competence. The story of the Ghost of the Range became institutional folklore, a required piece of oral history for anyone passing through the command. Sergeant First Class Eva Rostova was long gone, reassigned to another black-level project in some other forgotten corner of the world, her name once again redacted from view. But she had left something powerful behind. Her legacy wasn't the impossible shot. It wasn't the plaque on the wall or the name whispered in the barracks. Her true legacy was the cultural shift she had inspired. It was in the quiet focus of a young soldier adjusting his scope. It was in the humble question of an officer asking an NCO for advice. It was in the shared understanding that the ultimate measure of a warrior was not in the noise they made, but in the silent, unwavering precision of their actions. True legacy is not a monument of stone or a name carved on a wall. It is not found in the echo of a single great deed or the recounting of a past glory. It is a living, breathing thing. It is the standard that continues after you are gone, the discipline that is passed down from one hand to the next, the quiet philosophy that becomes the bedrock of a culture. Eva Rostova, the ghost, had fired one perfect shot, but its impact had created 1,000 ripples. Her greatest effect was not on the steel target 1,200 meters away, but on the hearts and minds of every soldier who witnessed it, and every soldier who heard the story afterward. She taught them that strength is not loud. It does not need to announce its arrival. True strength is calm. It is disciplined. It is found in the quiet moments of preparation, in the mastery of one's craft, in the humility to know that the work is never truly done. She demonstrated that respect is not a birthright of rank or appearance, but a consequence of undeniable competence. You do not demand it. You command it through your actions. Her silence was not a weakness. It was her armor and her creed. It was the silence of a professional who lets the results speak for themselves, who finds validation not in the applause of others, but in the perfect execution of their duty. In a world that constantly screams for attention, she was a whisper of excellence, a quiet testament to the idea that what you are speaks so loudly that no one can hear what you say. The story of that day on the range became more than just a tale of a great shot. It became a parable about seeing beyond the surface, about challenging our own biases, and about recognizing the profound strength that often lies hidden in the quietest people. It's a reminder that the most valuable members of any team are often not the ones who talk the most, but the ones who do the most. Her legacy continues, not because her name is remembered, but because her standard is upheld. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.